there'll be a water pump, and the water pump will always be on the front part of the engine. Water pump is driven off of the drive belts, which are the rubber belts that run off of the engine crankshaft. These belts, it's real critical, the condition of these belts, due to the fact that if they could become loose or they break, the water pump does not turn, which in turn heats the engine up too high and can damage the engine. Along with more hoses, we're connected to a heater core that sits underneath the dash. The heater core is used, obviously, to heat the inside of the car during cold winter conditions. One other object that's in the cooling system that's real important is the thermostat. The thermostat regulates engine temperature at all times. The more consistent you can keep engine temperature, the better off the engine is going to perform. You can run into problems with thermostats sticking either open or closed, which don't allow the proper engine heat, and in turn can damage the engine or cause it to run too cold, which will be really inefficient mileage-wise. Some of the indications that you might run into if you have a problem with the cooling system will be your instrumentation on the dash. Typically there's a cooling system gauge or a cooling system light which will come on, and it'll be a red light that will give you an indication that you're either overheated or you're low on coolant. These need to be checked immediately to prevent any damage to the engine. From the radiator is the coolant reservoir where the storage of the extra antifreeze and coolant level will be at all times. There's markings on that coolant reservoir of cold and hot engine operation levels. All reservoirs are clear, so at a glance you can see the coolant level in that reservoir. Whenever the engine cools down, if more radiator coolant is needed, it comes in from the reservoir hose to the radiator. Now on top of every radiator cap, you'll notice it'll say, "Danger, do not remove." This is a warning because if this radiator cap is removed on a hot engine, the person that removes it could be scalded seriously. Never remove the radiator cap on a hot engine. Always do it on a cold engine only. All coolant levels can be checked through the reservoir itself. We're going to move to the electrical system of the car right now, and the first item that we're going to cover on the electrical system is the battery. The battery's function is that of a reservoir for voltage. It's a massive reservoir which allows enough amperage and voltage to crank the starter to start the engine. Some of the features of the battery is the fact that it's connected with two large cables, one positive, one negative. You'll notice there's a protective cover over the positive so that no metal objects can come in contact with the positive and the negative cable at the same time, or with the positive and any part of the car. This will prevent any kind of major arcing which can damage any kind of computer or electronic equipment. The other thing you need to notice is that the cables stay clean at all times. Battery cables will corrode real bad and lose contact, which will prevent the car to work properly when starting. Most batteries on late model cars are going to be a sealed battery to where you can't visually check the fluid level. There's an electrolytic acid in here and a water level that on older batteries we can normally check. Some batteries today we can still check, but low maintenance batteries you don't need to check as often. From the battery, which is only used during starting, we're going to have to go to another system that keeps the car running after the car is started. The function of the alternator is going to be to supply electrical power to the car at all times after the engine is started. It's propelled or driven by a belt which drives off of the front of the engine. This belt tension is real critical. A loose alternator belt will keep the alternator from charging. At the same time, if you hear a squealing or any kind of noise made by a belt, it could very well be because of a loose or a poor condition of the alternator belt. The alternator is going to supply voltage to all aspects of the car, whether it be the headlight, the engine ignition, your tail lights, turn signal lights, air conditioning. Wherever electrical supply is needed, that's the function of the alternator. A real important part, if the belt breaks, the alternator will quit charging, and within a few minutes you're not going to have enough electricity to run the engine. Some of the warning devices that you're going to have with this alternator is on the dash. There is an indicator light or an actual voltage gauge will tell you the condition at all times. Usually when the alternator quits, a red light along with the gauge will come on, which will tell you there's a charging system problem. That charging system problem is going to cause the car to quit within a few minutes, so we need to pull over the side of the road or at least pull into a repair facility almost immediately. Okay, the next item on the car we want to cover is the starter. Starters will always be mounted on the lower part of the engine because they actually drive the crankshaft during engine startup. The only time the starter is used is when the engine is cranking to get the car started. As soon as it starts, the starter sits there, does nothing the whole rest of the time. Now, in order to use that starter properly, we have to have good cable connections at the battery, which we've discussed earlier, and a complete wiring system that is proper and protected. Now, when I say a protected wiring system, we're talking about the fuses, which will be underneath the dash or somewhere inside the car in a protected waterproof area. Now, the whole function of a fuse is the same as that in a household fuse, is to protect the wiring and the integrity of the electrical system of the car so that it will prevent any fires or possible fires. Anytime a wire is shorted, instead of starting a fire at that shorted area, the fuse itself will blow and protect the system. Anytime you replace any fuses under the hood or under the dash, either one, always make sure you replace it with the exact fuse that came out of it. Do not use a higher amperage fuse because these wiring systems are all engineered for the proper protection with the fuses that are in there. If there's any question, always refer back to your owner's manual for the answers. The component we want to start with in the fuel system is going to be the gas tank. The gas tank's a reservoir that's going to be in the rear of the car that is strictly used as a reservoir to hold your fuel for the demand of the engine. Now, on an electronic fuel injected car, such as what we've got right now, we're going to have an electric fuel pump that sits in that tank. The electric fuel pump is going to have to pump a high pressure. On this car, it's between 35 and 45 pounds. That's why they mount it in the fuel tank to where we have a lot of fuel around it. We pump the high pressure fuel out of the tank up to the line, which will then next go to a fuel filter. Now, one safety item I want to explain on the electric fuel pump is the fact that being it's electric and being it's a high pressure pump, it must have fuel on it all times. Anytime it runs out of fuel, the pump itself will dry up and burn the pump out. The fuel pump is submerged in gas at all times, and it uses that gasoline to cool the pump and lubricate the rotors in the pump. So always keep fuel in a fuel-injected car. Okay, from the fuel filter that's going to be mounted on the frame of this car, we're going to come up with fuel lines up to the fuel rail. Now, the fuel rail is going to be a supply line to all the injectors. On this car, a V6, there's going to be 6 injectors. That's why they call this a multi-port injection. Each injector is going to inject into each cylinder as the airflow flows into that cylinder. Now, all fuel injection systems will always have a fuel pressure regulator, which regulates the fuel pressure to keep the pressure exact so that you don't get a rich mixture or too lean a mixture and in turn affect your gas mileage or performance. From 1981, when the domestic cars became computerized, more and more injection systems have been integrated into the car to where today in 1995 there are no domestic cars manufactured with anything other than fuel injection on them. Now, some of you may have an older model of car that still has a carburetor on it. The carburetor is going to be less efficient. It's going to be more troublesome. The carburetor sits on the top of the car. It's going to use a different type of fuel pump. They use a mechanical fuel pump that's driven off